Hello everyone. Today we're gonna have the four statements here: conditional statement, converse, inverse, and contrapositive statements. So there's like four of them over here. This is the second part. I will put the link of the video of the first part in the description box below. So going back to this, conditional statement, the other name for this is if then. So if then is the other name for conditional statement, and there are two parts for every conditional statement. So the if part contains the hypothesis, and the after the then is our conclusion. So there will always be hypothesis and there's always a conclusion. So these are the rules that we have here. Again, this is taken care of in the first video, but let's jump into some examples. By the way, the second the second part, which is gonna be this one, talks about math statements. The first part talks about real life statements. So let's have some math statements and come up with statements here, other three statements, and we determine if the statement true or is the statement false. So let's take the first example here. So if two angles are corresponding, then the two angles are congruent. So the first thing that we need to do is to label where the P is and where the Q, because from there we can go ahead and come up with the rest of the statements here. So we're gonna start by labeling the P first. So the hypothesis part here is this part. So this is our P, and this is our Q. Okay, that's the conclusion part. Okay, to write the converse, we are supposed to write the Q first and then the P. So then the converse statement would be if the two angles are congruent. So if two angles are congruent, then we write the P, which is this part, then the two angles are corresponding. Okay, so before we jump into the looking at this, let's determine conditional statement. If two angles are corresponding, the two angles are congruent. This is true. Corresponding angles are congruent. Let's see if this statement is true or false. So if two angles are congruent, then the two angles are corresponding. So if we get congruent two angles, does it mean that it's always corresponding every time? No, alternate interior angles are also congruent. So this statement right here is false. Now let's have the inverse. So the inverse is we are going to negate. Again, negate means we just put a knot on the P. So if two angles are not corresponding, then not Q. So then the two angles are not congruent. So if two angles are not corresponding, then the two angles are not congruent. So let's say not corresponding angle is alternate exterior. So it's not a corresponding. Does it mean that alternate exterior angles are not congruent? They are congruent. So this statement right here is false. Now let's take the contrapositive. So contrapositive is if not Q, so we're gonna negate this, then not P. So we're gonna negate the Q. So if two angles, so that's if two angles are not congruent, then the two angles are not corresponding. And this statement is true. Again, we always remember that conditional statement and contrapositive, they go together. And if the conditional statement is true, then the contrapositive would also be true. And this converse and inverse does not mean that they have to be true every time. Sometimes they can be false. Sometimes they can be true. Let's take this example here. So we have a statement, if the sum of two angles is 90 degrees, so if we add two angles, then the two angles are complementary angles. And this statement is true. Complementary angles will always have 90 degrees. Now let's label the parts. This part right here is our hypothesis, P. And then this part right here is our conclusion, Q. Now let's write the converse, the inverse, and contrapositive. At this time, I would encourage you to pause this video and try this problem out on your own. And when you're done, unpause it and check your answer. Okay, we go over this. Let's have the converse. Converse is we flip the hypothesis and the conclusion. So if two angles are complementary angles, then we write the hypothesis, then the sum of the two angles is 90 degrees. Is this true or false? Let's look at it again. If two angles are complementary angles, then the sum of the two angles is 90. This statement is true. Complementary angles will always have a sum of 90. Now let's take the inverse. So the inverse is we negate the hypothesis. So if the sum of two angles, is not 90 degrees, then we negate the Q. So if P, then not Q, so we're going to negate this. Then the two angles are not complementary angles. Okay, is this true or false? This statement is true. So if the sum of the two angles is not 90, so let's say it's 80, then the two angles are not complementary angles, and that is true. They're not complementary because they don't sum up 90. So that is true right there. Now let's have the last statement here. So for contrapositive, we are supposed to negate the Q and then negate the P. So if two angles are not complementary angles, then we negated the Q already, and then we negate the P. Then the sum of the two angles is not 90 degrees. And this statement is also true. So as you can see, again, conditional statement and contrapositive will have the same truth value. They always gonna go together. It's true. And this converse and inverse doesn't have to be true. Sometimes they are false. It depends on the statement. Did you get all of these correct? Good. Perfect. If you find this video helpful, hit like and subscribe for more math videos. See ya!